Hey, good morning. This is Pastor Doug, ready for our Bible study in the Gospel of Mark. We are in the 6th chapter, looking at some amazing events that indicate that Jesus is who he claimed to be, the Son of God, as Mark reports them to us in his Gospel. So we're going to be looking at this good news together. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and get them out and turn to Mark, the 6th chapter. I'm going to pick up in verse 30. We're going to be reading through the end of the chapter. I'm going to be using the New American Standard Version, just the one that I'm familiar and use. Whatever version you have is great. Just read along with me. So if you need to pause it and go ahead and put it on there. And like a lot of people on video now, we're always saying, hey, man, subscribe to the channel. And that way you'll know whenever the next video comes out. And so I encourage you to do that as well. The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while." For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. They went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. The people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and it is already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. He commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves and kept giving them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided up the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces and also of the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and intended to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and they cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately there they spoke but immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and moored to the shore. When they got out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him and ran about the whole country and began to carry here and there on their pallets those who were sick to the place they heard he was. Wherever he entered villages or cities or the countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplaces and imploring him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak, and as many as touched it were cured. That is a lot of amazing events, and we're going to try to do our best to go through it. So hang on as we fly through these amazing episodes in which Jesus reveals that he has power over the laws of nature. He has to be the Son of God. There's no other explanation for it. Interesting that Jesus had sent out his disciples. Then he had heard the news of John the Baptist, as we learned last episode, and then came together, and he refers to his disciples now as apostles here in verse 30. Those who are sent out because they've already been sent. They get this name, get called this long before the Great Commission, because Jesus does send them out with his message. And they were gathering together with Jesus and Ogegas. And so just a word for to get together sounded the same root word of the synagogue, where the Jewish people gathered together for a variety of things, including their worship and teaching times. It was sort of a multi-purpose. They used it all during the week. And his disciples reported, that is, they heralded, they proclaimed to him all that they had done and taught. Now, Jesus, being Jesus, probably could have known exactly what they did if that's what he wanted to do, but they got to report. They got to come in with the good news. There's something about coming back after being out when you gather together and say, let me tell you what God has been doing. That's one of the things I miss coming together with God's people, are those stories of sharing. Hey, let me tell you one thing. Of all the stuff that God did this week, let me tell you about one thing that he did. But they told him about all the things. Don't know how long this meeting lasts, because there were lots of things that took place, lots of people who had been healed, demons have been cast, people who heard the good news and believed. We don't get the details of any of those stories, and I wish that we did. But he reported them all. And when they got through with the report, Jesus says, hey, I want you to come away by yourselves to a deserted place and rest. Jesus' ministry was growing. The disciples are starting to get known. While Jesus could continue on and on, the disciples could not. They got wore out and they needed to rest. There's something for us all in there. We can work hard, we can labor well, but we, as God designed it, need a day of rest. But the day of rest does imply that you're working. So these guys have been working. Jesus recognized that they were working beyond what they should have been. They needed to rest. He says that part of the reason is that there were so many people and they were coming all the time, they didn't even have a time to eat. We need to recharge our batteries, not with just rest, but we also need to eat well and eat healthily. If you haven't looked into the None of These Diseases study that's also online, I encourage you to do so. It addresses a lot of those issues from the Old Testament about God's way of caring for ourselves, both physically and mentally. When they went away, they were looking for a place to be by themselves. So they set out in the boat, and they're going up along the shore, you might say, going around we call it a cove, where the Mediterranean, the Sea of Galilee has a little hook in it. They're kind of going up from one place to the other. And the people are up on the shore. You have to understand the Sea of Galilee is kind of down lower. The shores are up higher, mountains around them where Jesus often goes into. They can look out, they can see the boats that are out there. They recognize the boat. They know Jesus and his disciples. They can look out there. It might look like a speck to us, but they're going like, hey, I know who that is. I can tell where they're going. And these people are so wanting to be with Jesus that they go cross country and cut off the path, you might say, to guess about where Jesus is going to land at. And they show up. So whenever Jesus comes ashore, while it was normally a secluded, deserted place, not anymore. There is this huge crowd. In fact, the term here is the word poly. It's a term for a bunch of, and instead of a bunch of people, this time it's a bunch of crowd. It's a huge crowd, bigger than they've had before. And he looks at them and he has compassion. And this is that term splanchna, the term for the guts. We get the word spleen out of it. And you know how you feel whenever you've got this gut reaction. He looks at them and he's got this gut reaction for them, not because they're sick, not because some of them have demon-possessed spirits, not because they don't have the truth. He looks at them because they look to him like sheep who don't have a shepherd. Sheep that aren't cared for, they're not led, they're not provided, they're not taken where they need to eat, they're not made to rest when they need to rest. They're not have any of the things that God would put a shepherd in someone's life for. God does put shepherds in our lives. The church, we call them elders, and they're the ones who are supposed to be coming alongside of you and helping give you direction and helping support and care for you, and be someone who is a positive person in your life, that's able to help you out, so that you're not running ragged, you're not running scared, you're not getting lost, you're not having troubles. You have someone who's looking out for you, and that's how a good shepherd worked. And so they were like these sheep without a shepherd. And so he begins to do what a good shepherd would. He begins to teach them, and we need that. When we don't know, we need someone to teach us. When it was already quite late, his disciples said to him, now he's teaching for a while. Mine says quite late. It actually says after hours, after Paulus, same word, after many hours. And you might get tired with a short teaching time. You might get tired with an hour teaching time, but we don't want hour and hour and hour. We would give up. But these people have come a long way. They are soaking up what Jesus has to say, and they don't even care that the hours are passing. They're just hanging on. They want to hear more. We don't know what he's teaching them, but probably the kind of stuff that's on the Sermon on the Mount, kind of stuff, the parables, the teachings, the things that have applications to their life to help them figure out how to live for God, dealing with the conflicts that they're encountering, dealing with the pressures in their life, learning how to respond to the people around them as God would want them to respond, and putting their faith and their trust in God to look after him. So we have Jesus teaching in other times, so we get the idea of what it is. Mark just doesn't report what he says in any of the details. And it is quite late, and it really is a deserted place, as we're told in here in verse 35. And again, that quite late is they'd been there a lot of hours. And since it's a deserted place, there's not much around for them. And so the disciples come to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, can you send these guys away? They need to get something to eat. Now, my translation says so they can buy themselves something to eat, but that term for buying is just the word gathered. That's why it talks about them going into the countryside, that is the fields, or into the cities, because there were a lot of fields that they would plant along there, and those that were poor could at least take the grain, like the disciples often did, and get something to eat out of that. They had money. They could go into the villages and buy some food. He said, this is the solution. Send them away. They need to eat. Remember, Jesus, we hadn't had a chance to eat either. And then now we not only traveled and we got to this place and hours there, and Jesus, we're hungry. And I don't know how you get when you're hungry, but I almost kind of get it a little bit that these disciples are a little bit on the hangry side of things. And they're trying to do something about it, get Jesus to get going. Of course, he's not affected by it. And Jesus answers them and says, no, in command language, you give them something to eat. And they said, how are we going to do that? You want us to spend 200 denarii on bread to give them something to eat? Now, a denarii was essentially what you would get paid for a day's wage. And so, an average day, I don't know how many hours they worked back then, but today we'd say 8 hours. And given what our current minimum wage is, 200 days' wages would be approximately $16,800. So this was quite a bit of money, even on the low minimum wage kind of scale. And so they're going like, Jesus, we don't got the money to do this. Is this really what you want us to do? You want us to figure out how to do that kind of a thing? And he says, no. What I want you to do is tell me what you have. Um, he actually asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go look. So they do. Now we know the story from the other Gospels about finding the boy and those kind of things, but Mark skips all of that detail. He just says that they come back and they tell him, we have 5 and 2 fish. 5 loaves, 2 fish, which isn't much. And so Jesus commands them, all those crowds, to sit down. Mine says by groups on here, but they kind of had a phrase that they used back then, sympoison, and it gets translated groups by groups, but it's actually the word to drink together. We'd say drinking buddy groups. Get together with these groups by groups. Maybe we'd better, since we're the church, might say that they're meal groups. You'll find that in the commentaries as well, but it's actually a term for drinking together, and have them set on the green grass. And so they sat down in these groups by groups, and these groups were not what you and I think of. Have I ever thought about a drinking group? I think of like a small pub, maybe 15, 20 people. But these groups were big because this was a huge crowd that had gathered. He puts them down in groups of 100 and groups of 50. Can you imagine a meal with 100 people or a meal with 50 people, and you're in all these groups all over the place? And the menu says, oh, for everybody, 5 loaves, 2 fish. Nobody's going to get much unless something amazing happens. And it did. That's why we love this story. Jesus takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looking up toward heaven. Now, Mark doesn't say that he prayed, doesn't say that he gave thanks. He just says that he looks up toward heaven and he blesses. Now, the term there for blesses is eulogomai, good words, thanksgiving, praise. And then he breaks the loaves and he kept giving. He just kept breaking, kept giving, and he sets it before the disciples, and they then divided up among all of these groups of people who have gathered about, and all ate, and all were satisfied. I don't know the last time that you ate in a big group like that, and there was plenty for everyone. But not only was there plenty for everyone, there were leftovers. And it's interesting that there were 12 baskets full that were left over. And so these leftover baskets were full of the broken pieces of bread and the leftover fish. So everybody's eaten, everybody's satisfied, and guess who has to clean up? The disciples. Our sort of doubting disciples who had just come back, remember, telling Jesus about all the amazing things that happened. And then they get here, and even though they've seen God at work, they're having trouble really accepting that this is the new normal, that they're going to see things and God entering in and doing amazing things is how stuff really happens. And so there are 12 basketfuls, I think one for each of the disciples, carrying this big basket going like, what's in my basket is more than what we started with. Oh, there's another basket and another one and another one and another one. I think it's Jesus' way of basically saying, you of little faith. And so while they go through here, there we're told, 5,000 men who ate. Now, a lot of people want to say, well, what about the women and the children and everyone else? And so they'll multiply that number. It's a huge group that Jesus fed. And immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. So, and had them go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. So the disciples get in the boat that they've been traveling in. He sends them out onto the Sea of the Galilee, and he goes back to the crowd. He dismisses the crowd. He was certainly able to dismiss them, could have done it earlier, but he wanted to have this teaching time, this compassionate time, not only with these people, but with his disciples, because his disciples are needing to learn a lesson. And so after he sends them away, he bids them, probably the crowd, farewell. Maybe the disciples are already out and going. And then Jesus goes up onto a mountain to pray. And as I said, we have the Sea of Galilee, we have the shore that goes up. We don't know which mountain he goes up into, but he can look out. He can see quite a way onto the Sea of Galilee, just like everyone else. And as he's praying up there, man, time goes by. It's already late in the evening uh, when they dismisses everyone. The night has come on them, and they're out there, and it says that they're straining at the oars. And this term that gets used for straining is really a term that means that they're using all of their strength trying to make that happen, trying to get through, and it is taxing them. It is, I mean, they're giving it everything they can. And when you do that, when you hour after hour after hour, it is torture. And that's really what this word means. They felt like they were being tortured on it, tormented in it, and they were going at these oars, and the wind was against them. And before they were able to get across there fairly time, they had plenty of time to get their side, but not in the middle of a storm. And it was already the fourth watch of the night. Now, fourth watch, typically the Jewish divided the night into 3 watches. So whenever the sun went down, you would have people who would stay out and they would watch to make sure that you were safe. And then it was divided up evenly. The Romans are the one that divided up into 4 watches. They would later expand that number. So there is some argument about where does the fourth watch last. But typically they only had 4 watches at this time. And so we're talking about early morning hours. They have been at this all night long. And so in the morning watch, they have been up, they have been straining. They think their lives are depending on it, and they're just not getting anywhere. And they're wore out. And they look out, and here is Jesus now walking on the water in the midst of this storm, and it looks like he's just going to keep on going. And so they say, hey, man, what is this? They sort of freak out a little bit. It says that they cry out because they're seeing something they don't know how to comprehend. And I think that maybe Jesus is just a ghost. And so they see him, and it says that they are full of fear. They're terrified, my translations say, but it is to be just completely frightened. And immediately, Mark's good word, immediately again, Jesus, speaks to them. I don't know if you've ever tried to speak to someone across any kind of a distance in the middle of a storm, but most of the time it is hard to communicate. But here, another amazing part of the story is that Jesus speaks. All of the disciples hear him. And he says to them, take courage, it is I. That is, I'm not a ghost, I'm not a phantasm. That was their word for it. It's me. I'm really Jesus. Don't be afraid. We need to hear that message from Jesus when we are in the midst of storms, and we look out and we say, man, I need some help here. I am wore out. I don't know if I can keep going. I think the storm's going to get us. And then we see the help arrive, and we don't know if it's really God or not. What's going on here? And when God speaks to us, he always identifies himself. We say, oh, man, good, it's Jesus. We don't get the rest of the story. We don't get Peter stepping out of the boat, none of those kinds of things in Mark's gospel. We just simply get Jesus coming to them, getting in the boat with them, and immediately the winds stopping, the waves calming, the storm being settled, and they're astonished. They just don't know what to think about it. And the reason they don't know what to think about it, Mark says, is because they had gained no insight from the incident of the loaves. Earlier that day, they'd just seen this amazing miracle. They were now experiencing another amazing miracle, but they were completely astonished because they still hadn't got it yet. But That's because their hearts were hardened. We don't hear that much about the disciples, these apostles. They were in the middle of it, but their hearts were hardened. That phrase makes me think about Pharaoh and God dealing with him as he was doing amazing miracles around him, bringing him little by little to that point that he would finally accept that God was the one who's going to win and give in to him. And so Jesus is dealing with his disciples here. He's teaching them, he's training them, he is letting them know that he can do amazing things for them. And so that's exactly what's taking place. And once the winds and the waves stop, once their hearts settle down, once they're at comfort with Jesus, it says they cross over and they come to the land of Gennesaret, which is over on the east side toward the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. They moor to the shore because remember, it's morning. People are already getting up. And by the time they get out of the boat, even the people on that side recognize them. People from all over the country start coming toward them, and they still haven't had any of that rest that they set out for from the very beginning. There were people who are bringing out their pallets. There are people who hear that he's there. It says that every time they went to a village or a city, or even when they're just going through the countryside, people were bringing their sick. They were bringing them to the marketplaces. They were imploring Jesus, man, if they could just touch your garment, Jesus. You don't have to say anything. You can just keep going by. If they just let them touch your garment. It makes me think of that woman that we heard about in the stories earlier about reaching out and touching Jesus and being healed. These people are desperate. They are like sheep. They are in a terrible condition, and they are seeking help from Jesus. And they're just wanting to be cured. And while Jesus does all of those kinds of things, he doesn't want to just give us the temporary cure. He can heal our bodies, but our bodies aren't going to last forever, are they? He can heal our diseases. He can make us walk again. And those are all the things. If you're missing some of those things, you long for it, and you want to be made well. But Jesus ultimately wants to lead these sheep, as we read in Psalms 23, to the point that they can live in the house of the Lord forever. And so while he's taking care of them along the way, his ultimate goal is to get them to recognize that they have sin that's separating them from God. He wants them to turn to him, asking for forgiveness, and he will grant it to them. That's why he had come. He'd come to seek them, to seek those, to save those who are lost. And he's come for you. And you've already been saved, then he's going to be using you just like he used the disciples. Now, he might need to teach you a few lessons to get you on that point that you might have a stronger faith, that you might learn the lesson of the lows, that you might learn the lesson of the storm. And you let Jesus lead and you proclaim his truth so that those who hear it might put their faith and trust in him. That's our lesson for the day, and I'm looking forward as we get into the 7th chapter this next week. I hope you have a blessed day. See you later.